Think about the late 19th century in the United States and the conservation movement that grew up out of that time. Before Gifford Pinchot, who was the first head of the Forest Service, before Teddy Roosevelt, who became the great conservationist president of the United States, and surely one of the great ones ever, were people like George Perkins Marsh and George Bird Grinnell, who had found, in Grinnell's case, the Boone and Crockett Club, and in George Perkins Marsh's case, wrote the enormously important book, Man and Nature. What these earlier figures are doing is trying to understand how an industrial revolution changed humans' relationship to nature. George Perkins Marsh, for example, looked back in time and looked at Rome and at Greece and Athens and said, look at these enormously important empires. They all failed. Why did they fail? It wasn't the lead and the plumbing, which we used to think was it. It was about the natural resources that they consumed so much to the extent that those natural resources were no longer there. Or certainly that was his argument.
When the white man first came to North America, a great part of the continent was clothed in majestic forests. Trees flourished in countless numbers. But to the early settlers, trees were a barrier. They were something to be destroyed, to be gotten out of the way so that the land could be turned to agriculture. Except for fuel and for log cabins and barns, little use was made of trees that fell to the settlers' axe. Most of them were stacked and burned. But as America grew and the frontier was pushed rapidly back, many sawmills were established to make the vast quantities of lumber needed for building of a nation. The sawmills devoured trees by the millions. To feed them, the loggers slashed into the virgin forests with little or no thought for the future. They left scenes of desolation as they moved on to new forests to be despoiled.
George Perkins Marsh, for example, he's worried that the United States was going to do the exact same thing. We'd just be another Greece, only we wouldn't be as good as Greece because we would never have gotten to the empire status that Greece achieved because we're going to consume our resources much faster than that.
This was the great Northwest a century ago, awaiting only the genius of man to give impulse and meaning to its generous energies. And it called aloud in burning accents, "Bring me men to match my mountains."
George Bird Grinnell, for whom we need to thank for Glacier National Park and Yellowstone National Park, whose magazine, Forest and Stream, is the progenitor for much of sort of Ducks Unlimited and organizations like that, wrote in 1882 in an editorial that there's a link between forests and conservation and water supply. No woods, no water. No woods, no game. No water, no fish. That was his mantra. And it's all about habitat. If you destroy the woods, you don't have rivers. If you don't have rivers, you don't have fish and you don't have game. And he's thinking as a hunter thinks, and that's what the Boone and Crockett Club is in part about. But the resolution is repairing those habitats. And that's an argument flowing through George Perkins Marsh that Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot adopt and rigorously pursue, so that if you think about the national forests that would be created in the late 19th century and then that Pinchot and Roosevelt would create in even grander fashion in the early 20th century, so that they got up to about 150 million acres of national forest. If you take that mantra, no woods, no game, no woods, no water, no fish, and think about the real-life application of that model, that's the national forests. And if you look at where they're located, they're draped along mountain ridges. They're draped along areas that are watersheds. Why? Because the documentation that creates those national forests has two central key elements to it. The first of which is that these national forests must serve the continuous needs of the citizens downstream for watershed protection. Some of that's about flood control, but some of that is also about water supply. The other is timber, which is logical because these are national forests, and so that's what we focus on. But what we should also focus on is what the 19th century understood, is it's also about water.
Roughly 1/3 of all rainfall runs off into streams, rivers, and lakes, and these constitute our chief surface water supplies. About 1/3 soaks into the ground and becomes our underground water. Part of the rain is used up by dense forests, which require about 20 inches annually. Rainfall is unequally distributed, with the result that we find native forests in the west and east.
And if you strip off the lodgepole pine, if you take out the great redwoods, you take out your own downstream water supplies, and you don't want that. And so what these guys are thinking out, they're thinking out in grand terms. Foresters imagine a landscape they will never live to see, 70 to 80 years out. And so when Pinchot and Roosevelt are conspiring, and they are conspiring, I mean, trying to figure out how to do this, they're looking out in time. In effect, if you think about it, what time are they looking out to? Hours. They're imagining our world. We live within the world that they imagined in their heads. And so we're deeply dependent upon the ideas that they came up with and the politics that put those ideas into action. And we owe them a lot because of what they were able to imagine. They don't build all of the national forests, but the ones they go after in the West, around Los Angeles, around present-day Phoenix, around Denver, around Utah, around Salt Lake City, around Seattle and Portland. If you think about what they were picking, they are picking the water supplies that still supply the water for the major Western cities. Upwards to 30 to 40% of Western water supply are shed off of national forest land. That's a huge resource. If you go to Atlanta, in the east, its water rises up out of the Appalachians, some of which is national forest land. Roughly 8 to 10% of all national water supplies come over as national forests. These guys knew that. They understood the hydrology, which is linked back to the woods, which is linked back to why you want a governmental intervention that creates a national forest, not a local forest, but a national forest, because this is the way by which we resolve those sets of issues.
We are now in Lufkin, part of the East Texas commercial timber region. Approximately 1/5 of the broad expanse of Texas is covered with some type of forest growth, which is larger than the forested area in any other state in the nation, and on a comparative basis equals an area about the size of the whole state of Florida. Of the forested area in Texas, about 2/3 are classed as protection forests, while the remaining third constitutes the commercial forests, which produce primarily the products useful to man.
For the American South, these problems came later, and so did the national forest. It's not until the 1930s that the national forests really become a possibility in the South. And it's during the New Deal, the second Roosevelt, not the first, that's able to do this. And if you look at Texas, as well as Arkansas and Louisiana and the other southern states, what you're looking at is land that came into the national forest inventory that had already been clear-cut, chopped out, turned into lumber, and because it was the 30s, and because the corporations that once owned the land didn't want to continue to pay taxes, as happened in East Texas, they offloaded what was no longer productive land for them onto the federal government. The federal government, in the guise of Franklin Roosevelt, was willing to take the land because they knew that in regenerating that landscape, they would need to hire people to do that work.
Virginia. Inspiring his forest army by a personal visit, President Roosevelt makes his first tour of the Civilian Conservation Corps camps in the Shenandoah Valley. After inspecting Skyland, the commander-in-chief takes a seat at the head of the table to eat with the boys, and he enjoys every bite of the plain, wholesome food furnished at the camp.
It's very good to be here at these Virginia CCC camps. I wish I could see them all over the country. And I hope that all over the country they're in as fine condition as the camps that I've seen today.
And so the Civilian Conservation Corps that Roosevelt created, but which, by the way, owes its origin to work that Gifford Pinchot had done as governor of Pennsylvania in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And when Roosevelt was governor of New York, a neighboring state, watched what Pinchot did, and when he became president, asked Pinchot for guidance, and the CCC is part of that process. Because what Pinchot did in the 20s and 30s was to buy up timberland in Pennsylvania, as he said, to make Penn's woods woods again, and then hired unemployed workers to go in and reforest that landscape. Well, Roosevelt takes this model at the state level and applies it nationally. And where it happened, it turns out, is in the American South, which had been by this time clear-cut, much of it anyway. Some of the most valuable land had been clear-cut by this point. So, the 1930s in East Texas, lumber companies are giving to the federal government at very cheap cost, because it's costing them nothing to get rid of this stuff. The government's buying it for $1 an acre, maybe $2 to $3 an acre. Devastated landscapes. What do? They refurbish it. And over the next 20 years, the Forest Service in the West and in the South is regenerating landscapes like crazy that had been cut over, that had been gullied from erosion, that had been devastated by floods. They repair that land. It's one of the best pieces of environmental restoration work you can ever find. It was good work, it was important work, but it was very much involved with the public health. Change the land and you change the people. Serve the land and you serve the people, which is the motto and effect of the Forest Service and has long been. That's remarkable effort. But what's interesting about the National Forest in East Texas is because there's so much rain there, that stuff regenerates very quickly. And what happens in the 1950s and early 1960s? Who wants that land back now for cheap, please? The very lumber companies that had given it away. The government suddenly had created this real enormous asset, but it's now within the federal control. And inside them are reservoirs. And what are those reservoirs serving? As water for downstream urban civilization, Houston and Beaumont and others. And so they're serving not only local interests and regional interests, but also the larger public and greater good. It's one of the things that Pinchot said about the Forest Service's mission. Its job, he said, and he said it variously, but something along this line, our mission, the way we resolve the competition of interest, is the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. That was a variable. It shifted over time. The greatest good would change over time. And what the South discovered, and East Texas discovered, is a greater good was served by the presence of those national forests that regenerated that landscape, that produced those reservoirs, and that also produced the political conflict in which they have been enmeshed. So there's a long and interesting history around which these forests were framed, but it does seem to me lies with the larger question of whose land is it? How should it be managed, under what conditions, and under what consequence?
In 1891, Congress began setting aside large tracts of timber as national forest reserves and watersheds. These national forests now exceed 160 million acres, and state and private holdings add millions more. But the fact that some of these tracts are called reserves does not mean that no trees are cut, for trees are like any crop. They must be harvested when mature. Otherwise, they rot away and are wasted. The important thing is to harvest the big trees without killing the young ones, or to leave enough mature trees to reseed the area again. So today, the government and some forest industries are cooperating on a program designed to ensure a continuous supply of timber and steady, well-paid employment.
1905 is when the Forest Service was created, and the national forests were created alongside them. For the first 40 years, between 1905 and 1945, basically the agency was a custodian of the land. Its job was to regenerate, its job was to protect, its job was to add to the inventory, and in the process begin to rebuild landscapes that had been devastated by railroad companies, mining companies, overgrazing, and overharvesting. They did a really good job of it. Such a good job that by the end of World War II, some of that land was at a point in its growth where it could be then recut. And the question is, under what conditions would that happen? Part of that is forced by not so much industry, though they would love to get at these national forests because many of their private holdings had already been cut out in the war years itself. Most of the land, most of the wood that went into the war effort came off of private property, not public property. But it's also forced by another energy and drive, and we've been talking about that. The car, the freeway, and the suburb.
This is the American dream of freedom on wheels. An automotive age, traveling on time-saving superhighways. More than 1 million persons each year have pulled up stakes in the cities and turned commuter. Part of it is due to that relative newcomer to our economy, the budget-priced home.
If you're going to build housing for the post-war GI vets, for the baby boom that was already underway in the mid-40s and then exploded in the 1950s, and you and I are part of that, where are they going to live? Under what houses are they going to live? And at what cost? And it's the cost that's key.
Consider Levittown, Delaware Valley, USA. The speed and precision teamwork that makes possible this mass production of low-cost homes on a profit-producing basis is a tribute to the enterprise of the American construction industry.
One of the keys to understand the clear cutting that would become the silvicultural technique that the Forest Service, as well as private industry, embarked upon in the late 40s and early 1950s, is the consequence of that was, and the desired consequence was to depress wood prices. So you bring lots of wood into market, you drop the price, which means you just drop the price for a GI vet, like my parents were both GIs, who could then afford to buy a house in Darien, Connecticut, built maybe not out of a national forest wood, but built out of wood that's entering into market, whose prices are dropping.
For in the hopes and dreams of everyone, there's a home they can call their own.
And we'll have the living room right in here. And the kitchen right here, so we can see the children playing in the yard.
Yeah, the children.
So some of this is about the sort of social manipulation of the economic structure. So how do you get wood best into that market? You got it completely. But you had to test that, and some of that is driven by academic research that is indeed funded to a degree by industry. Forest schools are, of course, a product of the wood product industry. I mean, there is a hand-in-glove relationship. Some are more so than others. Some were more strictly scientific and less industry-oriented than others. But all of them in the 1950s are producing a great number of forest engineers whose job it is to get the cut out, and to get it out fast and get it into the market, to build those roads, to build those houses, to build this new economy that's emerging in the 1950s and 1960s.
Now a glimpse of another great natural resource, the forests of the South, the most extensive in the country, an asset of tremendous importance to the nation. This vast timber supply today furnishes a large part of the nation's lumber and wood pulp needs.
There was very little oversight. They tended to cut and not think about the downstream consequences in terms of erosion and gullying and the like. In a short, the agency changed. What once had been in a custodial agency no longer was. An agency that once followed Gifford Pinchot's dictum was shifting that dictum in a way that had environmental consequences that Pinchot himself had warned about in the 1930s, in which he came out publicly against clear cutting.
You know, little runaway raindrops love forests where too many trees have been cut down, and rangelands that are overgrazed. These hoodlum raindrops leave a trail of erosion, wasting soil that is needed to grow plants for grazing cattle and sheep, and trees for timber. Well, I wonder what's happened to Junior. Just what I feared. He's formed a gang, and they're whooping it up for a flash flood. No longer satisfied with flash floods, The gang is planning bigger and wetter floods. Junior's getting dangerous. He's getting tougher and bolder every day. Now he's top gangster. Heading for the big time, raging along, waging gang war. And all because somebody started a forest fire. Somebody cut down too many trees. Somebody put too many cattle and sheep on this range. Well, sir, Pop Cloud is pretty disgusted with man's carelessness.
Gifford Pinchot thought basically that clear cutting was a bad technique because of what it did to the land. Not that it didn't get wood product out, and he thought that was all good. What it also did was to destroy the land because you just went and just chopped the stuff out and rolled it down into the market. And he thought basically that the agency was becoming, well, he called it lumbermanitis, that it was infected with that disease, and he was in opposition of that. But he died in 1946, so that voice is gone in opposition. And many in the profession were sort of went, whew, thank God he's gone, because he was a bad influence on them. That is to say, he was this hectoring voice, kept saying, you're doing the wrong thing, you're doing the wrong thing. This isn't public service. This is in the service of the handmaidens of industry, in effect.
It's too bad Junior didn't know his watersheds and land on a good one. Junior and all the other raindrops could be useful if they're treated right. Until more people cut only trees that can be spared without damaging the land, and plant seedlings as needed, improve their management of rangelands by allowing no more cattle and sheep than there's grass to feed, we can't expect little raindrops to behave.
So that sets up a tension for the agency that saw its mission shift in the 50s and 60s. That's brought to a startling conclusion when in that same 1960s, the Wilderness Act of 1964 is enacted. Clean Air and Clean Water bills are enacted. NEPA, the Environmental Policy Act, is created, in which you now have to let other people in on your decision making. Well, nobody had been in on their decision making before. Suddenly this process is becoming democratized. They're getting hit by groups like the Sierra Club, who used to be close with the Forest Service, but no longer are. In East Texas and elsewhere, they're finding that the groups that used to be their supporters are now starting to raise questions about water quality. Well, now they have legislation that raises that issue. That are raising questions about why you're doing what you're doing. And let's talk about the Endangered Species Act, which came out in the exact same time. Nobody thought that the red-cockaded woodpecker or the spotted owl was an issue until we have an act that says, you know what, species matter, not just the human species, but all species. And we have to think about the consequences of our action. Keep in mind George Bird Grinnell. No woods, no game, no woods, no water, no fish. Other species matter. Their habitats are critical, not just the human one. And that logic built into the Endangered Species Act now became a wedge issue and a hammer that other groups could say to the agency and to the Bureau of Land Management and also to the National Park Service, by the way, hey, you can't build there because there are other animals that depend upon that space. And that had a tremendous impact on the Forest Service in terms of what it was able to do and what it imagined it was able to do, and also internal to its own culture. It had to hire ologists, as they called them, biologists, hydrologists, and the like, who turned to the engineers and said, you can't build the road there. What do you mean you can't build the road there? I always build roads there. I'm sorry, you can't build the road there because the soil won't sustain it. The debris will destroy this river, and if you destroy this river, as Marsh argued, you won't have any fish. This is salmon country. You can't do that. So all of these things are interrelated, such that even internal to the agency, there are brawls that are taking place between the engineers on the one hand and the ologists on the other. Well, no surprise, that debate in microcosm is exploding outside this agency, in and around those lands, as timber companies, which had depended upon this agency to produce the wood that they did in East Texas and elsewhere, are suddenly confronting people called environmentalists who are telling them on their property how to run their business because it has downstream consequences. This is why in East Texas and Louisiana, as well as California, Oregon, and Washington, and in New Hampshire and Virginia, we're seeing a national explosion of debate over environmental issues that revolve around species and water and habitat and also human sustainability. Because the larger object of the debate is, can human beings coexist with nature and other species and sustain all of this simultaneously? We're still having that same fight because we haven't found the answer yet. If we want to have more sustainable communities, if we want to have an environment, a natural environment in which we build ourselves and are able not to destroy that place, but also not to destroy ourselves, to have economies that function appropriately, then you show them how in the past people have struggled with those same issues and have done it better and worse than we will do it, who have done it, in some cases, they don't even know that that's what they were doing, and in some cases they failed. They failed miserably. They chose the wrong tactic, and as George Perkins Marsh would say, well, look at Athens. Why are there no cedars in Lebanon? Because they blew it. Which leads to another point, which is that we are active agents in our own history. We don't just live in the past that other people created. We are conscious, or we should be. We are politically engaged, or we should be. We should be men and women of integrity. And of that, we need to recognize that part of what makes us citizens is not just citizens of a place in which we have a right to vote, but citizens who have an obligation to act. And the decisions that we make as teachers, as students, as members of communities are so important to the development of those communities, as a forester would tell you, 70 to 80 years out beyond our own capacity to imagine them. Our grandchildren are what we need to be thinking about. Our great-grandchildren are who we need to be conceiving this world as, because they're going to have to pick it up after us. And so whatever debt we owe to those in the progressive era, we have to recognize, and we have now a responsibility to those who live in an era we can't yet imagine.
So climb up, you ladderback, see red cockaded, get furious, you flickers, PO'd pillated. Well, curse the clear cutters, raise hell like a hellion. We're joining tonight the Woodpecker Rebellion. When they clear cut out west, they leave mountains with patches, wounds in the forest that bleed in the streams, forcing the salmon to change their direction. The streams like the loggers, too silty to see. Here we go! So climb up, you ladderback, see red cockaded, get furious, you flickers, PO'd pillated. We'll curse the clear cutters, raise hell like a hellion. We're joining tonight the Woodpecker Rebellion.